Good evening, year 13. It's Miss Sarmiento again. I'm back with another episode for our 3.1 internal mini-series. This episode, we're going to look at long-term consequences. We're going to go over what that means, and then we're going to go over a few of the long-term consequences of this event. So let's define it real quick. What are long-term consequences? I've got two definitions here. So first one says that long-term consequences are consequences that occurred years, decades, or centuries after the event. And then the next one says a situation, result, or agreement that continues to exist or have an effect for a very long time after an event. So these two, like I said in the previous video with two different definitions, these two are correct, and you can refer to either one in your internal. So now let's go over a few long-term consequences of the epidemic in Samoa. So the first one here, we've got, so for some survivors, the incident that happened in Samoa became a foundation upon which other grievances against the New Zealand authorities would be built. Essentially what this means is because of the whole situation with the epidemic in Samoa, a lot of Samoans then became very distrusting of the New Zealand government and the authority they had over Samoa. So in 1919, in fact, Western Samoans petitioned to request transfer of authority over to America instead of New Zealand, thus fueling a long-standing distrust of New Zealand government. So basically, a year after the epidemic came and went, Western Samoans wanted to be under the control of America because of how well American Samoa dealt with the epidemic. They dealt with the virus very swiftly and they were left unscathed, whereas Western Samoa, which is less than 100 kilometers away from American Samoa, ended up being one of the biggest casualties during this epidemic. And we can see this distrust in the government today, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. We can see some parallels. Many people of color, including Samoans and other Pacific Islanders, are weary of the government concerning COVID-19 procedures, and this can be attributed to intergenerational trauma caused by the incompetency of New Zealand government during the 1918 epidemic. So essentially what this means here is that because of the impact that the New Zealand government's choices during the pandemic were back in 1918. Because of that impact, a lot of Samoans, a lot of Pacific Islanders, a lot of people of color in general are not easily swayed by what the government says in terms of what to do during situations like this, during a pandemic. I'm sure a lot of you have an auntie or an uncle somewhere who talks about how the vaccines have chips in them and they're going to track us, or maybe you have family members or family friends who think that the pandemic is a hoax, that it's fake, because I definitely do. It's the same with the Philippines. We've had a lot of issues with our colonizers, with our imperialists. So we are very weary. A lot of people in the Philippines are very weary of what the government says concerning things like this, like the virus. And that same goes with Western Samoans. A lot of them to this day are quite distrusting of the government, and we see why. The next consequence we're looking at is how the epidemic, restructured family and political structures for many years to come. So amongst those who were affected by the virus in terms of death, 45% of Matai died during the epidemic due to the virus, and entire villages were wiped out completely. So entire families were wiped out. And the high proportions of deaths among young adults and amongst leaders would have meant a very long-term impact on the country's development. So because a lot of Matai died, a lot of their predecessors ended up dying as well. And so it took a while for families, for villages, to kind of put everything back together and get back to where they were. And that is a long-standing consequence of the deaths that happened due to this epidemic. So not only did leaders pass away during the epidemic, but entire families. So that is also another long-term consequence. Entire families were completely wiped out. There was no one to carry on their names, and so that was that. Um, that's what I've got so far. I don't want to give you too much because I want you guys to go ahead and look at this in more detail yourself. I want you to find different consequences or find more information about these consequences that I've missed out. Another consequence you can also look at is the apology that happened 80 years after the epidemic. The Prime Minister at the time, Helen Clark, was in Samoa for a luncheon, and there she made a formal and very public apology on behalf of the New Zealand government for what they did and for their incompetency during the epidemic in Samoa. So that's another one you can look into and dig a little bit deeper in as well. But yeah, so that's that for long-term consequences. In the next video, we're going to look at short-term consequences of the influenza epidemic in Samoa. I hope you guys are working really hard on your internals. And once again, I want to say thank you to those who have gotten back to me via email. You know, I'm always here to help out if need be. Awesome. I hope you guys have a really good night and a good rest of your week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.